Hello, in this episode of ToThePointCode, we'll be creating a login system with React.js from start to finish. We will make use of components such as Formik, styled component, Yap, and also Redux. Useful links as well as timestamps will be in the description below. To start with, let's head to the command line and create our React app. We will use nps create React app and give it a name. In this case, I'll call it ttpc login. Once our app has been created, we enter the directory and open the project in the code editor. In the code editor, we see that a lot of files and directories have been generated for us. Now we'll delete the files that we will not use in this episode. Now in the public directory, let's open the index.html file and make some changes. We will change the contents of the title tag. Now let's copy our logo and put it in the public directory and rename it. Once we've done that, let's go back to the index.html file and make change to our icon link. Now back in the source directory, let's open app.js and make some changes. We'll clear the content of our div tag and put hello world. We also clear the imports at the top of the file. Once we've done this, let's visit our index.css file. We will create a general style rule at the top of the file. In this rule, we want to set our margins and paddings to 0. Now let's create some directories we'll be using in our project. In our pages directory, let's create the pages that our project will have. Now we want to use an external font for our project, so let's go to Google Fonts. Once we've located the font, we click on it and copy the link. Now back in our index.html file, we paste the link in the head tag. Now in our index.css file, we need to change the font family to match the link that we just added. Now let's make some changes in the index.js file. Now let's run our project with yarn stats on the command line. This should open it in a browser. Once our app is open, we should see hello world displayed. Now let's open another command line in the same directory and install styled components. This is what we'll be using to style all our components. Once we are done, let's create a styles.js file in the components directory. We will use this file to house all our styled components. At the very top, let's import styled components. Once we are done, we want to define all the colors that we'll be using in this project for consistency's sake. We will define it as an object and export it. So for the most part of this tutorial, you can just follow along and type on your computer if you want, and you should get the same result. Now let's copy the images that I'll be using in this tutorial into the assets folder. Once we've done that, let's import the background into the styles.js file. We'll be using this for our first style component. Now in our first styled component, we will call a styled container and it will be a div. And remember, in styled component, we use string literals or backticks instead of our normal quotation marks. For the background property, we'll be using a linear gradient and also the background. In doing so, we want to create a faint dark tint on our image. Now back in our app.js, let's import our styled container and apply it. Since it is not the default export, we need to import it in the curly braces. Now going back to the browser, we see that our background has been applied and we see hello world in the center. Remember, sometimes you have to wait a while and refresh your browser before you can see the change, because the React code is compiled before it displays the output. Now let's create our home component in our home.js file. For the start, we'll just put a paragraph containing home in there. Now let's import the home component into our app.js file and replace our hello world with it. Now let's start creating our home page. So we replace the home paragraph with a few divs. Once we are done, let's head to our styles.js file and create a few components. You shouldn't be worried when you see errors and warnings when writing the code. These will normally disappear after you finish writing the code and it has been compiled. Now back in the home.js file, let's import our components and start using them. Now we can see that our home page is starting to take shape. Let's go back to our styles.js file again and create some more styled components. In this case, we'll create the avatar. This will be the component for our logo that will be put in on top of our pages. We are setting it up in a way such that the image to be used will be passed to it as a property. So now in the home.js, let's put our avatar there. Under the view menu, I toggled word wrap so that we can see all the code on this page. Now we import our logo and pass it to the avatar component. You can see that it is being displayed, but we want it to be at the topmost part, so let's style the div that contains the avatar. Now our logo is looking as we want it to look. Now to facilitate movement between our pages, we will use React Router DOM. So let's install it. Now back in the styles.js, let's import link from React Router DOM and style it. We'll use it to create our buttons. Over here, we want to change the behavior of our button when it's being hovered on. Now to make the change in behavior smooth, let's add a transition property. Now let's import the styled button and use it. We will create a button for login and another for sign up. Now let's specify the links where our buttons point to. Once we are done with this, we need to wrap our whole app in a router that comes from React Router DOM. So let's import the router as well as other components that we'll be using later on. Once we've done that, we should be able to see the output of our button. Now we can see the output of our button, but it doesn't look right yet. So let's create a component that we use to fix the styling of our buttons. We will call it button group and we'll wrap it around our buttons. So as usual, let's import our component and wrap it around our styled buttons. Now on refresh of our page, you should see that the position has been fixed. Now let's move on to our next page, which is the login. To do that, we'll first create our login component and just put login text in it. We'll then export and replace the home component in our app.js file. But we'll still leave the import of the home component there, since we'll be using it later on. On refresh, we're still logging in our browser, but the background is still there, and that's the look we are going for. Now for the login, we'll be using Formik to build our forms, so let's install it. Once the installation is complete, let's create some styled components. In this case, we are styling our input field. Now let's check for an invalid prop in our input. We will understand how it works later on. This invalid prop will trigger different stylings when it's available. Now when the input field is in focus, let's apply some styling. Let's style some more components. This time let's create a styled label. Now we'll use this component to wrap our whole form. Because we'll be reusing it, we want to pass the background color as a property when using it. Next on the list is our form button. We want to create a styled button. But this time around, instead of using the link that comes with React Router DOM, we'll be using the regular button. Now because this form button is very similar to the first button we created, let's copy the styles and make some changes. Now let's go to our login.js file and make some imports. Now let's make changes to our login component. Over here too, we'll be using our logo, so let's import it. Note that we will reuse our component as much as possible, so whenever we need something, we just import it from our styles. If you remember, our style title takes a size property which determines the size of the text. On refreshing, we can see our logo and our title. Now let's make some imports from Formik. Once we are done, let's use it in our login component. Now the Formik tag will take a function as a child, and this contains our form. To ensure reusability and a high level of abstraction, we want to put our Formik input in a different file. We'll create a file called form library, or formlib for short, in our component directory. Now in our form library file, let's make some few imports from Formik. Also, we import some styled components from our styles.js file. Now let's create and export our text input component. First of all, it will take props as a parameter. Now using the props, we will set up a Formik field. So we have a field variable and also meta, which contains information about the field. So when we are using the input field, we will pass the label as a property to the component, and that's what we are putting in our style label. Now we'll make use of our style text input and spread the field and also the props on it. Now back in our login.js file, let's import our text input and use it. Now we have to pass all the necessary properties to our text input. So we will create two fields, email and password. Now let's bring in our button group, which we will use to properly style our form button. We need to pass a type of submit to it. So now we have our form with the input and button we created. But the input seems to have a faint outline, so let's take that off. We will do that in a styles.js file. Now looking at the input fields, we styled it in such a way that there is a gap at the left side. In each of the input fields, we want to put an icon that matches the input field at the left side, and we will do that using React icons. Once we've seen it, we'll head to the command line and install it. Once we've installed it, let's create a styled component for the icons. We want to ensure that it's properly aligned in the input field. Now for some of the input fields such as the password, we'll be having icons both on the left and the right side. So in a styled icon, we check for the right property. If the right property has been provided, then we style that particular icon to the right side. Otherwise, we stick to the left. Now in our form library, let's import the styled icon and use it. So the value that we supply to the icon will be provided when the text input is being used. Remember to add the icon to the parameters of our component. Now in the login.js file, we need to import some icons from React icons and supply it to the input fields. Now on refresh, we see that our icons are showing, but they are showing at the wrong place. So let's fix it. Now in the form library, we see that I use styled instead of style as the property of the dev. So let's fix it. On correcting and refreshing, we see that the icons come back to their actual position where they are supposed to be. This might not be the case for you if you caught the error at first glance. Now our icons are fine, but our colors look a bit off. So let's go into our style text input and make some tweaks. First of all, we change the value of our color and add a background color. By doing that and refreshing, it looks like our targeted work. Now in our form library.js, let's go and work on the eye icon for the password field. So we import the eye icons from React icons. Now from the props, we want to check and know when the field is a password field so that we can render the eye correctly. Now we need to toggle between the two eye icons when it is off and when it is on. To do that, we will use state. So let's import useState from React. Let's call our state show. Our default value will be false. So now using the show variable of state, we can know when to render each of the icons. Now we need to pass an onClick to the icon so that we can toggle the value of show. This onClick will make use of setShow to set the value by negating the current value of show. Now for the password field, we need to use a customized text input so that we can be able to vary when the password can be seen and when it cannot be seen. To do this, we'll make use of the show variable once again. So for the type of the input, we will toggle between text and password. Using the text will allow the password to be seen. So to prevent the rendering of double password fields, let's check when it is not a password so that we render the other normal text input. Once we've done that, everything should be back to normal. But there is an issue when I try to change the value of the password field. This is because Formik requires the initial values so that to be able to change them. So let's set them up in the login.js file inside the Formik tag. So we pass the initial values prop, which takes an object of all the fields and their initial values. Let's also add the onSubmit prop. This will be called whenever the form is submitted. For the meantime, we will just log the values to the console. The values will be passed as a parameter to the onSubmit function. In addition to that, we get other useful methods such as setSubmitting. This will help us to tell Formik that we are done with submission of the form. Now back to the form, we can see that changing the value gives no error. And the eye toggle tool works fine. Now for the validation of our input fields, we will use Yap. So let's install Yap. Yap will give us all the tools that we need to properly validate our input values and also set the appropriate errors. Now to start with, let's import all as Yap into our login component. Now to use Yap with Formik, we need to add the validation schema property to our Formik component. This will take a Yap object. In this object, we define all the rules for our input fields. So for the email, we require it to be a string first of all. It needs to be an email. If it does not match the email property, we return an error message. Also, it is required, otherwise we return a required message. So the messages to be returned will be passed as argument to the Yap properties. For the password, we need it to be a string, and we can set the minimum and maximum length, and pass an error message if the password does not obey this rule. Once Yelp returns an error message, we need to display it. So let's create a component to display our error messages. We'll do this in a styles.js file. We also create an extract text component which we will use later on. Once again, we'll take the font size as a property when we are using the component. The color of the text too can be passed as an optional property. Now back in our form library.js file, let us import and use our error message component. To know whether we have an error message or not, we use the meta property. With the meta property, we will know when our input field has been touched, meaning it has been changed, and whether an error has occurred due to that change. If the input field has been touched and also an error exists, then we can go ahead to display our error message. We check for the touched so that the error messages will not be displayed anyhow. Now, if there is no error message to be displayed, we will still use the error message tag, but we'll set the visibility to hidden so that we will still maintain the shape of our form even though there is no message to be displayed. Now let's test out our form. By supplying an invalid email, we see that the message is displayed. And the same happens when we put in a short password. But we aligned our message to the left, but it is showing at the center. So let's fix it. Going through the error message component, we see that I missed a semicolon. I put a colon instead of a semicolon, so let's just change that. On changing that and refreshing, we see that the error messages display at the left side, matching the design we are looking for. Now you might remember that we checked for an invalid prop when creating our text input. We want to use that to style our input field when there is an error. So whenever there is an error, we want to pass an invalid property to the text input field. We will do this in the form library.js. We will once again use our method.touched and also method.error to set the invalid property. That is, if our input has not been touched and there is no error, the invalid property will have a false value, and therefore the styles will not be applied. Now testing out our input again, we will see that when you have the error message, the background is changed to red, which is what we are looking for. Now if you are still with me up to this point, a sub to this channel will be very appreciated. Now back to our login.js file, let's use our extra test to display a message for a user who is on the login page but wants to go to the sign up page. The sign up needs to be a link, and we will create a component for that. We will call our component test link. We want it to look like a normal test. Now once we are done, let's import the components into our login.js file and use them. Now let's pass a to property to our test link to indicate where we want our link to lead us to, in this case, our sign up page. Now refreshing and testing it out, we will see that the styles have been applied. Now one more thing, as usual people put copyright messages at the bottom of their web pages. So let's put a copyright message under this form. To do this, we need to create another styled component. In this case, we'll call it copyright text. Now back in our login.js file, let's import the copyright text and use it. We'll put it just below our start form area so that it is displayed just below the white background. Now we can see that our copyright text is displaying nicely below our form. Now when we click on the login, we see that there is an ugly outline around the button. This depends on the browser we are using. So let's clear the outline from the styled component. Let's do the same for our other styled button. And now when we click on the button, we see that the outline is no more. So typically, when we provide a valid email and a password and hit on the login button, we will see some kind of loader or spinner. We want to do the same to our form. We will do that using React loader spinner. So now let's install this package. Now once we are done, we need to import a particular CSS file into our project. You can find this import on the React loader spinner page. Now once we've copied the link, we paste it in our app.js file. Now back to our form in the login.js file, we'll make use of a property that Formik provides for us. It is called a submitting. This returns a boolean true or false to indicate when our form is submitting. Using this, we can know when to display our loader spinner and when not to do so. So we take a submitting in as a parameter. Now let's import our loader. Now when our loader is displaying, we use it to replace our button. So let's put our loader in the button group component. Now for our button, let's check when our form is not submitting and display it. Once we've done this, we can save and refresh our work. Now when we provide valid details and submit our form, we will see that our loader is showing. Now let's move on to our signup. So in our signup, we'll do something very similar to what we did in our login.js file. So let's copy all the code and paste it in our signup.js file. Once we've done that, let's import it into our app.js file. Now back in the signup.js file, let's make some changes. Now for our sign up, we will need some extra fields, so let's add them to our initial values. First of all, we want to repeat our password. Also, we want to take our date of birth, and lastly, our full name. We will also need to validate these extra fields, so let's add some extra validation rules. Now for our repeat password, in addition to it being a string and being required, we need to make sure that it matches the original password. In this case, we'll use a Formik property known as oneof. With this oneof, we pass an array to it and put in our password field as a reference. So now the value of our repeat password should be at least equal to the referenced password for it to be accepted. Otherwise, we would return an error message. Now let's copy and paste some of the text input fields. We copy and paste our password once and copy and paste our email field twice. Now let's change the values of the properties. For the date field, we'll get rid of the placeholder property since it will not be needed. So once we've done this, let us import two new icons for our date of birth and name fields. Once we've done that, we will place the value of the icon property. Now at the bottom, let's make changes to our extra text. We'll change our link to login and the path as well. Now saving and refreshing, we'll see that our changes have been made. Now at this point, let's go ahead and set up our dashboard page. To do this, we'll go into our home.js file and copy the content. Let's also import our dashboard component into our app.js file. Now let's make some changes in our dashboard.js file. We will need just one button, so let's get rid of one. Also, let's change the details to logout. We don't need our link to point anywhere, so let's just put hash. Now let's import styled form area, which we'll be using to give us a little background to our text. Now let's copy our button and text into the styled form area. Let's pass our background color to our styled form area. To do this, we need to make sure that we have colors imported. On saving and refreshing, we have our dummy dashboard which says welcome user. We also have the logout button. Now back in our app.js file, we need to set up routes for each component so that we don't need to replace the component each time we want to see the output of it. To do this, we'll make use of the switch and also the route. The switch will always check for the current link and choose which component to display. Each of the routes will take a path which it associates with our components. Now let's copy and paste our route 3 more times and make changes. For the home component, we'll just use /. This will ensure that any other route which doesn't match sign up, login, or dashboard will go straight to our home component. Now, on refreshing, we see that we are taken to our home component. Once we click on login, we see that we are taken to the login page. The same applies when we click on sign up. The dashboard route works as well. So we have successfully set up our various routes. Now at this point, we can go ahead and start our authentication. To do this, we need a few React and Redux packages. So let's install them. Once the packages have installed, let's create an auth folder. Inside this auth folder, we'll be creating other subfolders and files. We'll create an action folder, reducers folder, and also a store.js file. Inside the actions folder, we will create user-actions.js file. Inside the reducers folder, we will create a root reducer file. Now let's start our work in our store.js file. We need to import some few components from the packages that we installed. Remember, with Redux, we are hoping to create a store which we'll be using to store the details of our user whenever the user logs in. Redux will make sure that we'll be able to access the information wherever we are in our project. In addition to the import, we import a session service. This session service will provide us the tools to store the details of a currently logged in user. All these lines of code make up the boilerplate code for Redux. We need to write this code in order for Redux to work. Now we need to initialize our session service and pass our store to it. Once we've done that, let's export our store. Now let's go into root reducer.js. We created this file under the reducers directory. Let's make some imports for our work. The concept of the reducers is to interact with our store and change up values whenever it's needed. Now let's export default our root reducer. Now let's go into our index.js file. Here we need to provide access to our store for our app, and to do that we need to import provider from React Redux. This will ensure that our app and all its components can have access to the details in our Redux store. We also need to import our store and pass it as a property. Now let's wrap our app with the provider component. So don't forget to pass the store as a property to the provider. think I made a typo in the root reducer file, so let's change it. We need to import session reducer instead of session reducers. Once we've done that and refresh, we'll see that there is no change, and this is perfectly fine. Now we need to create functions which will take our form input details and work on them, such as communicating with the backend. These functions are called actions in Redux. So let's go into our user actions.js file and create a few actions. We will need an action for login, an action for sign up, and also an action for logout. These actions will end up causing changes in our Redux store when necessary. Now we have the skeleton for our actions. Now back in the login.js file, we need to connect our login component to the Redux store and also import our login action. We will import our login action from the user actions file. Now on successful sign-in or sign-up, you might want to move to a new page, being its dashboard or another page. To be able to move around successfully, we need to have information about our history, and we will get this using the use history hook from React Router DOM. Now let's connect our login component to Redux at the bottom where we export it. Now connect is a higher order function, so we call the connect function, which returns another function, and we pass our login to it. For this component, we'll pass now and also an object of our actions to our connect function. Since Redux assigns the actions to our props, let's take in the login user action into our login component so that we can use it. Now inside the onSubmit property, we want to use the login user action. First of all, we want to pass in the values. Secondly, we want to pass in the history. So let's create the history variable using our use history hook. Thirdly, when we go to the backend and there is an error message returned, we need to find a way to display it to the user. So to do that, we will use setFieldError, which is provided by Formik. Once we use it, we need to add it to the parameters of our onSubmit function. Lastly, we will pass the setSubmitting function to our login user. Once again, this will ensure that we can tell Formik when we are done submitting the form. Now let's do something similar for our sign up page. So let's copy our auth and Redux section and paste in our signup.js file. We need to change the action to sign up user. Now let's connect our component to Redux using connect and also passing the action to it in an object form. Now let's take in the sign up user and use it in the onSubmit function. We'll pass in the same props as we did in the login file. Let's add setFieldError to the parameters. And also don't forget to initialize the history variable. Once we've done that, let's go into our actions file and accept the various parameters. Now in the login user, we will take in the values as credentials. We will also take in the history, set field error, and also set submitting. Now let's copy the same parameters for our sign up. So at this point of a login system, you want to make some checks and take an action which will result in a user object being returned with some data and also a status. Now based on the status, either fail or success or true or false, we base on that and allow the user access to our system or deny the user access and provide an error message. Normally the action you will take will be to make an API call to a backend or even interact with a database directly. In our case, we'll make use of an API endpoint, which refers to a backend server that we created in our first 3 videos. We created a server with Node.js and MongoDB. Now after we created them, we hosted it on Heroku. We did all this in the first 3 videos. So to be able to continue with this tutorial, you need to have that backend server set up. So you can check those videos out, build the backend server, and come back to continue from this portion. Now we can see the backend server that we hosted on Heroku, with which an API endpoint was provided. So we played with the API endpoint in Postman and tried the sign up and sign in features. Now if you've been able to set up the backend server that I'll be using for this tutorial, we need to make a slight tweak to what we achieved in our first 3 videos. We need to allow calls, which we didn't do. So first things first, let's change into our login server directory on the command line and open it in a code editor. Once we have done that, we will make the change in our server.js file. So what we are adding is CORS, which is cross-origin resource sharing. So it makes it possible for apps from different sources to have access to our backend server and access the resources available. If we don't add this access to our backend, requests from our front-end applications will be blocked by the browser. So let's head to the command line and install CORS as a package. Once this is done, we go into our server.js file and import CORS through the require function. Once we've done that, we pass it to our app.use. And don't forget it's a function. So once we've done that, we are good to go, and that's all we need to do. So now we need to commit our changes using Git and push it back to Heroku. So once we've been able to successfully push the changes back to Heroku, let's head back to the React section. Now to be able to interact with the API, we need to use packages such as fetch or Axios. In this case, we'll be using Axios, so let's install it. So once Axios is done installing, let's import it into our user-actions.js file. Now in the login user action, let's make a post request using Axios. I'll quickly copy the sign-in endpoint from Postman. In addition to the link, we need to pass the credentials. Also, we need to pass some headers. In this case, we will pass the content type header and set it to application/JSON. Once we've done that, we can attach .then because this function returns a promise. Also, let's catch any error that can occur and console.error it. Now back in the .then block, Axios will return a response, and this response will have a data property which will contain anything that our server returns to us. Let's remind ourselves quickly how this looks like. So back in Postman, let's submit our sign-in request with some credentials. We see that the request came back with status, message, and also data. Now let's invalidate our credentials and see what happens. So we still end up getting the status and message. So now back in our code editor, let's take out the data from the response. Remember, this data contains whatever is returned from the backend, including all the fields we saw in Postman. So now we check for the status using the data variable. Firstly, we will check for when the status is a fail, then followed by when the status is a success. Now let's take out the message from the data object. So once the status is filled and we have the message from the data object, we can make some manipulations to know which specific error has occurred and then direct it to the appropriate input field. So now, having a quick glance at our backend code, in the user.js file and under the sign-in section, we can see the various messages that our backend server returns, and it will give us an idea of what to expect. So to determine which particular field the message is intended for, we use the includes method, which is available for strings. So firstly, we will check for credentials. If the message includes credentials, then we set the error message for both the email field and the password. Remember, we are doing this because of how our backend returns data. If your backend server returns data differently, that means you have to do something else. Also, we check if our message includes password. If it includes password, then we set the error for the password field. Now, if the status is success, then we'll store the data returned in the user data variable. In this case, we will take the first index. To understand, let's have a look at Postman. If a request is sent with valid credentials, the backend returns a status, message, and data, but the data is an array. So in order to access the information in the array, we need to pass the index. So in this case, we access the first index of the data array. Also, let's create a variable token which stores the ID of the data that the backend server returns. Now, once we've done this, we want to create a session for the current user. To do that, let's import session service. Now let's use our token and user data to set up the session. Now after setting up the session and everything is fine, in the .then block, we'll use the history variable that we received to move to the dashboard. We'll make use of .push function that's available on the variable. Now after everything, we need to tell Formik that we are done submitting our form. So to do this, we pass a false value to the setSubmitting function. And let's get rid of the dummy data that we created. Now let's refresh and test it out in our browser. First, we'll give it a try with invalid credentials. We see that we are denied access and the invalid credentials message is displayed. Now let's try some valid credentials. And now we can see that we are moved to the dashboard saying welcome user. Now let's work on the sign up. To be very similar to the login, so let's copy the beginning part of the login. Once again, let's take the data from the response and check for our status whether it is failed or success. If it is failed, then we go on to check for the specific error message that was returned. Else, if the status was success, then we go on to log in our user. We can take a quick look at our backend code to have an idea about the kind of error messages that the sign up section returns. Once we know that, we can proceed. First of all, we will check whether the error message contains name. If it does, then we set the error message to the input name field. Else, if it includes email, then we set the error message to the email field. Once again, if the message contains date, then we set the error to our date of birth field. And lastly, if the message contains password, then we set the message to the password field. Now for the sign up server, we want to complete submission right in the field block. Now in the success block, meaning our user has been successfully added to the database, now we'll pick the email and password from the credentials that was submitted and log in the user using our login user action. And we need to pass in all the appropriate arguments for the login user action. Now because the login user function is a Redux action, we can't call it directly. So to be able to use it, we need to wrap it in a dispatch function. So let's take in the dispatch. Now for Redux actions, it is preferable to return a function. So let's wrap the content of our functions with a function and return it. In this case, we make use of the arrow function again. We need to do this for all our actions. For the sign up user, once we do it, we can pass the dispatch to the inner function instead. And also before I forget, let's change the ending part of our Signup API endpoint. Now let's refresh and try it out in the browser. Now on submission, we see that our user has been created and we are moved to the dashboard. Now let's work on the logout button. Now in our dashboard.js file, we need to connect the dashboard component to Redux and import our logout action. Now let's pass an onClick attribute to our logout button. This will go ahead to call the logout user action. Now like all our actions, we need the history variable. So let's import useHistory and create the history variable. Now for our logout user action, we need to take in the history and destroy the sessions that have been set. Once we've destroyed the sessions, we just move back to the home page. Now on refresh, we can see that our logout button works. Now let's observe something. Even though I've successfully logged out the user from our system, should I visit the /dashboard route, I'll still get access, which is very bad. So we need to fix it. To do this, let's go to our component directory and create some wrappers for our route. In this case, we'll create auth route and also basic route. With the auth route, we use it to ensure that once a user is not logged in, the user will not have access to our dashboard. On the other hand, the basic route will ensure that once a user is logged in, visiting the sign up or login page will redirect you to the dashboard. Now let's start with the auth route. We need to make some few inputs. Now let's create our auth route component and connect it to our Redux store. Now as the parameters, we will take the children passed to it and also authenticated. Authenticated is provided to us by Redux React session. With this, we will know whether a user has been authenticated or not, and this will enable us to know when to redirect and when to allow access to the requested resources. Also, we'll take the rest of the properties. So auth route will return a route. Now the changes will happen in the render property. In this property, we'll make use of the authenticated variable. So for the auth route, once the user is authenticated, we want to allow access to the children that the user requested for. Otherwise, we want to redirect the user to the login page. So the to property of the redirect component takes an object of path name and also state. So just like our Redux actions, to be able to access authenticated from Redux, we need to pass it to the connect function. But for state variables such as authenticated, we need to create a map state to props function, which returns an object and pass it to connect. So in the map state to props, we will destructure or take the session from the Redux state and fetch the authenticated value from it. Once we've done that, we'll pass map state to props to our connect, and this should provide us access to authenticated. Now the basic route will be very similar to the auth route, so let's copy the content and paste it in it. Now let's make a few edits. We change the name of the component and what is exported. And now all we need to do is negate the value of authenticated. So in this case, the children will be returned when the user has not been authenticated, but when the user is authenticated, the user will be redirected. Now back in the app.js file, let's make use of the new route components that we've just created. We will give the auth route to the dashboard route and the basic route to the login and sign up route. Now once again, Redux React session provides us with a checked value. This checked value will indicate whether the authentication has been checked in the first place. So if the authentication has not been checked, we will refrain from rendering any component. But if it has been checked, then we go ahead to render our component. So we make use of the checked here, and we need to take it from the Redux store. So let's connect our whole app component to Redux as well. Once again, we'll make use of the map state to props, since we'll be taking a Redux state, which is the checked. Let's correct our connect import to React Redux instead. Now let's try it out. Let's try to go to the dashboard without logging in. We see that on doing that, we are redirected to the login screen, meaning our route is working. Now let's try to log in. Once we do that, we are redirected to the dashboard and it says welcome user. Now if we try to access the login page, we see that we are redirected back to our dashboard because we are already logged in. Currently, our dashboard only displays welcome user, but we can do better. So let's try and fetch the current user's details and put it on the dashboard. We make use of map state to props. We once again take in the session variable and target our session.user. Once we've done that, we need to take it in as a parameter to our dashboard component. Now we can edit the style title and put our user's name over there. Now we see that our current user's name is being displayed. Now let's display some other details about the user. To do this, we'll make use of the extra text. So let's import it from our styles.js. So let's display the email of our user and also the date of birth. Now we see that the email and our date of birth are being displayed, but the color property is not working. So let's go into the styles.js file to fix it. Now in the extra text, we see that I missed the semicolon. So putting it there and refreshing our page, we see that our color is now working. So now let's maximize our browser to see the beauty of our work. Though this is not the most beautiful site ever, we've gotten it to perform the functionalities that we wanted. So we've been able to create a working login system using React. Okay, so this has been a very long tutorial. If you stayed with me up to the end, thank you so much for watching. If you learned one or two things, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.